to this episode of the Rise to Reign podcast. In this episode, we're wrapping up our little mini series on sovereignty. So sovereignty is one pillar in the Rise to Reign framework. There are seven pillars, 7 categories. And I would say it's definitely the most important if we were to categorize them by importance. In fact, the whole entire system hinges on sovereignty. They're all necessary, but this one is really big and really robust and really important. So in the first one on sovereignty, a couple episodes back, I actually introduced the concept of sovereignty. And when I tried to go forward, I really felt that it needed some expansion. So I spent an entire episode after that, the last episode, on consent, which is an integral topic about sovereignty and around sovereignty. And this episode is actually going to be on the quality of being blameless. So if you'll remember from the prior episodes on sovereignty, and if you haven't listened to them, I definitely recommend that you go back and do them because it builds precept upon precept, line upon line. And if you remember, I'll repeat it, the mechanism by which we give our sovereignty away is blame. So I'm going to unpack blame a little bit more because blame is a true root cause. If you look at problems in relationships, if you look at problems in the micro, in your finances, in your body, in the world globally, on the macro as well, blame is at the root of much of it. So if there's a problem that Rise to Reign solves, it is the problem of blame. And so I really feel like we need to spend some time understanding what it looks like to live a blameless life, to be without blame, and what that might look like. So I'm going to give you some really practical tools, tell some stories, but I'm also going to invite you to dream a little bit with me about the life that you can have and the world that we can create without this scourge of blame. So let's start by talking a little bit more about projection. So projection is a psychological term that just basically means that you see other people as like a movie screen, and what you see playing out on the screen of them is really what's coming from a projector that's inside of you. So you take what you're experiencing but have disowned, and you see it and experience it through another person or even another situation or sometimes an institution. So I'll give you kind of an example of that. When I was growing up, my dad was really angry. He had bouts of anger and bouts of rage. And so as I grew up, I really developed a pattern of being codependent and really walking on eggshells and trying to make him okay so that I could be okay. And that's pretty typical in a type of environment where you have a person who's a rageaholic or an alcoholic. There's always the family that is enabling that pattern of behavior in a codependent manner. The two go together. So I grew up with a really, really, really angry father, and I made a lot of unconscious decisions about how men are and how life is, and how my dad was a pastor for a period of time, and how God is, based on growing up with really all I knew, which was my father. And so when I got older and I started having romantic relationships with men, I would play this dynamic out over and over and over again. And it was so unconscious because all I wanted to do was get away from the chaos and the fear of my family of origin. But I ended up finding myself in the same situation with very, very small nuances. I mean, almost identical relationships over and over again with a really angry person that I had to walk around on eggshells and make okay so that I could be okay. And so that is an example of how we project what is unhealed in ourselves onto the other situations and the other people in our lives. Now there's a bunch of other things involved there from a psychological standpoint, but I want you to get the picture that when I haven't owned my own codependency, I am going to automatically see that and attract it in a bunch of different situations that I actually unconsciously create so that I can undo the dynamics of the past. And so really when I talk about blamelessness, when I talk about becoming blameless, it's really a way of undoing projection. So your nervous system is like a tape recorder. And every single circumstance that you've ever found yourself, everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard, everything that you have ever experienced in your life is recorded in your subconscious mind. It's all there. You can't necessarily recall it on demand, but it's all there, buried in your subconscious. And so some of those obviously experiences are good. Some of them are sort of neutral, and many of them are traumatic. So I coined this term to help explain this to my clients, but I call the repository of all of the trauma and the woundedness that we experience throughout life, I call that the toxic tank. So if you imagine you have like a tank inside your nervous system, inside your subconscious mind, and you're walking around with all of this trauma and all of this hurt and all of these unhealed wounds in this tank. And just imagine that it's slimy and it's gross and it smells bad, but we keep a really tight lid on it. Okay. So most of us just go through our life and the toxic tank stays somewhat buried. But when something happens, when we get triggered, that's when we find out, or we face adverse circumstances. That's what we find out what is in that toxic tank. That's when stuff comes up and escaping out of the toxic tank. So when somebody makes us mad, or when somebody rejects us or insults us, or somebody cuts us off in traffic or doesn't listen to us, we find that those old patterns and those old wounds get sort of bumped and they come up out of the toxic tank. And it can be quite off-putting or upsetting because you want to be a reasonable person. You don't want to blow up. You don't want to lose your temper. But sometimes it hijacks you and you find yourself being out of control. One of my patterns that hopefully I've become more conscious in my later years in maturity, I don't find myself experiencing this as much anymore because I'm aware of it. And awareness is key. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But one of mine was of not having my experience validated when I was a child. So being gaslit a lot when I was a child. So if I said, I'm hungry, no, you're not, you just ate. Or if I said, I'm sad, and I was crying, it was quit crying, you're fine. And so I was constantly told how I was feeling and wasn't listened to. And so as an adult, when I became a mother, most of the things that my kids I was, pretty patient, pretty chill for the most part. But when they didn't listen to me, when I told them to do something, or when they ignored me, I would find myself just losing control of my mind, just like, and not like screaming or yelling or anything, but just, I think hopefully some of you know, all of you know what I'm talking about. Is just I would find myself just having this, like this, and it wasn't, and I was even noticing, I'm like, this isn't that big of a deal. Why is this so upsetting for me? Like, why does this make me so mad? Well, it was because it was triggering something that was already there. And that thing was now coming up, wanting to be expressed and wanting to be healed. But we don't want that. We don't want to feel that. We hate that feeling. That we tried to get away from that feeling. So what do? We take it and we try to throw it away. And so becoming blameless is really a process of healing and sitting with your feelings and acknowledging them and processing them through so that they can come up and out. So, and then as you do that, that toxic tank begins to empty and you begin to experience a lot more peace. Now, remember, the kingdom or the queendom in Rise to Reign is righteousness, which is right relationship with God, right relationship with yourself, and right relationship with others. Peace, which is nothing missing, nothing broken, the idea of human flourishing, the Hebrew idea of shalom, and joy, which is just a calm delight. So that's our birthright. That's our natural state. So anytime we're not in righteousness, peace, and joy, we're outside of the kingdom or the queendom in one of the false selves, which is either the prisoner, the slave, the prince or princess. So we want to cultivate self-awareness as we find ourselves being triggered by circumstances in our life, because believe it or not, everything is happening for you and for your good and for your healing. It doesn't feel good and it's not enjoyable, but it is good. It is good if you respond the right way and if you interact the right way. So let's talk about the process of being triggered. Okay, so the process of being triggered goes like this. There's some very specific steps. It happens very fast and usually unconsciously, but the progression goes like this. So a perceived offense takes place. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, or your kid doesn't listen to you, or your spouse doesn't call and come home for dinner when they said they would, or something happens, and we'll call that a perceived offense. And immediately what our minds do is creates a judgment. So the judgment is a meaning that our brains give the offense based on our prior experience. This is really, really, really important. It's not based in reality at all. It's based on our prior experience. Our brains are meaning-making machines, and our brains are always collecting data. Remember, everything that you've ever experienced is recorded in your subconscious mind, and it pulls on that data to create a meaning, and that's a judgment. So for instance, if your husband doesn't come home on time for dinner and doesn't call, he could be in a car accident. His phone could have gone dead. He could be in a meeting with a client that he just literally can't get out of. And there's a million different explanations, but your brain's going to pick the one that is emotionally charged, that reminds you or that mirrors or recreates a situation, usually from your childhood. So it goes like this. When my dad didn't come home, he was out drinking and being unfaithful to my mom because he didn't care about her and us. And that's your little girl mind making a meaning based on her experiences. So you see how that works? So you make that judgment based on your prior experience. The offense happens, you make a judgment, which is a meaning based on a prior experience, and then you go straight to blame, which is deciding who or what is at fault. So in this situation, it's the husband that's at fault, probably. That's where you're going to go. And then you're going to go to the next step, which is accusation. So accusation is where the projection happens. This is where we see in others the emotion or the effects of the emotion maybe that we don't want to own in ourselves. This is where we take that hurt from being a little girl whose dad was unfaithful or unreliable and off onto our husband. And chances are he is blindsided by this and doesn't have any idea what's going on. And then what? He feels shame because fault was assigned to him. He gets defensive, and it probably is now going to trigger something that happened in his childhood, and he's going to take that and blame, offend, judgment, blame, accuse you right back, and now we're in a fight. And we are playing out a pattern from each of our childhoods, not making any progress or constructive forward motion in our relationship. We're just trying to we're racing for the victim position and we're playing hot potato with blame and shame. And it's really counterproductive, and it absolutely destroys relationships. So we have this example that is fictional, but I have a feeling that if you've ever been in a romantic relationship, you might be able to maybe understand or relate to what I'm talking about. But it doesn't just happen with romantic relationships. It happens with parents and children. It happens between countries when in diplomatic discussions. This is how war takes place. And so it's really, really, really important to see this process in order to gain emotional intelligence, to heal, to gain emotional maturity. How many of you know that it doesn't matter how old you are where emotional maturity is concerned? All of us know a 65-year-old toddler. Maybe you are a 65-year-old toddler. So this is how we mature emotionally. This is how we gain emotional intelligence and expand emotional intelligence. This is how we heal. This is how we heal so that we can rule and reign in our lives and be at cause and live our purpose and love our lives, enjoy our relationships, and feel at peace, righteousness, peace, and joy. Okay, so a quick word about accusation. In Revelations 12:10, Satan is called the accuser. So what I want to make kind of a strong statement here that hopefully you remember. It's that you're never more like the devil than when you are accusing. You're never more like the devil than when you're accusing. And some of us have more self-control than others, so we don't have a lot of accusation that comes out of our mouth, but we think it in our mind. We think it in our mind, and it's maybe slightly less destructive because you're not giving power to it with your words, but you're still accusing, and that carries incredible weight in the spiritual realm. That energy of accusation is a real thing, and it's very, very destructive. So you're never more like the devil than when you're accusing. Now, I want to add something else. I want to pull something else into here because maybe you're thinking, I'm not too bad at this because I get along with others and I just am mad at myself. And so how many of us have that mean girl voice, inner dialogue that's constantly accusing ourselves? You're fat, you're stupid, you're lazy, you did this again. So remember, you can be accusing yourself as well, and it's every bit as destructive as if you're accusing other people, even if you're not speaking it out loud. So on the flip side, you're never more like your Heavenly Father or God than when you're exercising sovereignty and offering amnesty. So our very next podcast, I promise this time, is going to be on amnesty, which is forgiveness, and that's the way out. That's how we get out of this prison of blame and accusation. But remember, you're never more like the devil than when you're accusing, and you're never more like God than when you're exercising your sovereignty, you're walking in your sovereignty and offering amnesty. Okay, so this is where I want to kind of dream about what's possible if we give up blame. Because you might be thinking, well, heck yeah, I'm convinced I want to give up blame. But blame is an emotional addiction. I would say most of you are absolutely addicted to blame. It's super seductive. It's super seductive because it feels like justification. It feels like pain relief. There is a perverse pleasure in the brief moment, but it always leads to multiplied suffering later on. So I just want to dream for just a few minutes about the blessings of being blameless. And I pulled these out, every one of them out of scripture. So they're like promises for you if you decide that you don't want to participate in and engage in blame. So Job 8:21 says, "He will fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with joyful shouting if you are found blameless." Psalm 37:37 says, "Consider the blameless, observe the upright. A future awaits those who seek peace." So there's this correlation again with the kingdom. So peace is found in blamelessness. Psalm 37:18, "The blameless spend their days under the Lord's care, and their inheritance will endure forever." Proverbs 11:20, "The perverse heart are repulsive and shamefully vile to the Lord, but those who are blameless and above reproach in their walk are his delight." Proverbs 11:5, the righteousness of the blameless will smooth their way and keep it straight, but the wicked will fall by his own wickedness. So there's this juxtaposition between the righteous and the wicked, and there's a correlation between being blameless and being righteous. Again, a connection into the kingdom or the queendom. Proverbs 3:25 says, do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the storm of the wicked when it comes, since you will be blameless. So there's an offer of protection that comes with being blameless. Proverbs 2:21, for the upright, those who are in right standing with God, will live in the land, and those of integrity who are blameless in God's sight will remain in it. So a promise of being established. Proverbs 28:18, he who walks blamelessly and uprightly will be kept safe, but he who is crooked or perverse will suddenly fall. Proverbs 28:10, he who leads the upright astray on an evil path will himself fall into his own pit, but the blameless will inherit good. So there's an inheritance that comes with being blameless. Righteousness guards the one whose way is blameless, but wickedness undermines and overthrows a sinner. Proverbs 13:6. So those are just straight out of scripture, some promises and some offers that come along with this idea of being blameless. And I also wanted to make the tie-in, and hopefully you saw that the kingdom, righteousness, or the queendom of righteousness, peace, and joy is directly tied to this idea of being blameless. So there are two different meanings of blameless. The first one is that you've done nothing wrong. So blameless means without blame. So being blameless could mean that you don't deserve any blame and that you've done nothing wrong or you're above reproach. Also righteousness. So this is the state of being right, in perfectly right relationship, of being innocent, I guess, of no wrongdoing. So here's another scripture from Job. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered and reflected on my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God with reverence and abstains and turns away from evil. He maintains and holds tightly to his integrity. So there's that aspect of blameless, of being really perfect as a human being. If that seems out of reach to you, I have good news for you. Just wait for a second. The other idea of blamelessness, one is based on our deservingness of blame or not. This one is that you don't engage in blame, that you don't blame other people, so that you're not worthy of blame, but you're also not one to blame other people, other situations, other institutions. So both are necessary for sovereignty, and both are necessary for righteousness in your part of taking part in the kingdom of righteousness, peace, and joy. But that begs the question is, which among us is without reproach? Who among us has lived for very long and doesn't deserve some blame for something? Who hasn't made mistakes? Well, there's nobody. There's no human other than Jesus Christ, who walked the earth as a perfect man, who deserves to be called blameless, because we all, to varying degrees or another, have really messed up. Some of us more than others. We're all deserving of blame. So that is really the reason why blame is hardwired into human consciousness. It's what happened when at the fall of man, is that we had blame wired into our human consciousness as part of the fall of man and as part of that curse that came on us. And you see that blame happened right away. I covered that in a prior episode, but when God came walking along and said to Eve, what have you done? She said, the serpent. And when he said to Adam, Adam said Eve, and then blamed God. So it's just like this hot potato of like, it's not my fault, it's not my fault. Well, blame provokes shame, and we were never meant to carry shame. The reason why shame is so intolerable to our nervous system, the worst feeling ever, is because we weren't ever meant to carry it. You don't have to carry it. We are not meant to carry shame. And so we try to throw it off onto others. And there's an example of this in the Old Testament when the Israelites were in the wilderness and they were learning how to follow God. And they had this practice. This is where the term scapegoat comes from. They had this practice where the priest would bring a goat into the assembly, and the people would put all of their sins and their mistakes and their shortcomings, and then they would run the scapegoat out of town and out of the camp, and the scapegoat would carry all of their sins away. Well, this is a type and a shadow of what Jesus actually came to do. So let's talk about shame for just a second. Shame is a negative emotion caused by an awareness of wrongdoing, hurt ego, or guilt. So shame can be caused by a hurt reputation or embarrassment, whether or not one's own guilt is involved. So this can be shame can come from something that's done to you. And so if somebody violates you, if somebody perpetrates an offense against you, then you feel shame. And it's not because you did anything wrong, but it's because you are ashamed of what has happened to you. And so this is a prime opportunity for blame, because we're wanting to get that off of you. Because you hurt me, because you stole from me, because you did this. Now this is happening because of you. So it's a prime example or a prime opportunity for shame when we're wronged. Shame always results in a loss of dignity. And to be restored to original design, which is our full dignity as humans made in the image of God, as kings and queens, as our righteous nature demands, our full dignity has to be restored. So we have to have a place to put our shame. Shame doesn't just go away. You can't, as much as you try, even when you accuse and when you hot potato blame and try to throw shame off of yourself, it doesn't leave, because then you're ashamed because you accused someone, and it just is this awful, vicious cycle. And so that's the absolute beauty of the gospel. And I think this is missed so often in the simplification of what is presented sometimes in church, is that Jesus came to save us, but he came to save us from everything that lessens our dignity as humans. Every bit of suffering, every bit of sorrow, every bit of shame has already been borne away by the once and forever scapegoat. The scapegoat in the Old Testament was a type and shadow of what Jesus came to do for us. So the gospel is the divine exchange. We get to give our wrongdoing, and we get to give our shame, and we get to give our blame. We just get to give it to Jesus. He takes it on himself, transmutes it, and gives us back righteousness. So that's a free gift, that we can give shame and get back righteousness. And that is all that's necessary. It's not based on our performance. It's not based on our worthiness. It's just because he loves us, and that is what he decided, how he decided he would deal with this problem that we created of shame, that was created by the human race way back in the garden. So when we resort to blame, we're trying to find a place to put our shame. When we blame others, we blame ourselves, and sometimes we even blame God. For us to be restored to our original design and actually experience healing, our full dignity, we have to have a place to put our shame. So we have that in Jesus, and that's why complete healing and restoration isn't possible apart from the cross. So I mentioned in season number 1 that I wanted to come out and be honest about what I believe and the foundation of healing that happens, that the fullness of it can't happen without the cross of Christ and without the gospel. Now, these principles will work no matter what. They're universal principles, and you can experience a high degree of healing. But to get all the way down to the root, we have to get rid of blame. We have to get rid of blame. And the only way that we can get rid of blame is to have a place to put our shame, to have somewhere we can get rid of it and offload it. And if we offload it onto other people, it creates more shame. It creates a cycle of shame. It creates a cycle of shame for them. Sometimes we try to offload it on God by blaming him, or offload it onto an institution like a church or a school or a government or a president. And when we do that, not only are we perpetuating shame in the world because we're now putting accusation and fault on them, but we have shame that boomerangs back onto us because we participated in accusation and it just feels awful. So Jesus is the interruption of that cycle. Christ is the interruption on that cycle. He incarnated into the matrix of humanity so that he could fix this problem for us. And it's all we have to do is just assent to it. All we have to do is just agree to it. All we have to do is give our consent to Jesus Christ to take away our shame and give us back his righteousness. It's a free gift for anybody who wants it. So that for to get all the way down to the root and pull this thing up so that it doesn't just keep cycling, we have to have the cross. We have to have the gospel. So in order to be blameless, we accept the free gift of righteousness offered by Christ. And instead of trying to throw our shame off onto others, we take it and just give it to him. So we interrupt the blame cycle by getting curious about our reactions to offense instead of looking for who and what is at fault. This is the framework of true inner healing. Next week, we're going to get into amnesty, which is forgiveness. We're going to get into amnesty of like receiving forgiveness for ourselves and also offering forgiveness to everything that agitates us and that we become offended by. So this can be easier said than done. I mentioned most of us have a lifelong addiction to blame. It's our go-to. And though it feels good in the moment, it's a large cause of much of our misery. So, my friends, that was a deep dive on blame and more appropriately on being blameless. We're going to unpack it a lot more next week, but now you have the foundation and we have the sort of the foundation that we can build upon, that we're going to be able to build a structure for healing and getting so much freedom and being able to live as kings and queens, reign in our life. Because God wants you healed so that you can wholeheartedly live your purpose and love your life. That's it for this episode. If you want to leave me a voicemail or ask a question, go to amykillingsworth.com/podcast. Otherwise, I will see you next week on the Rise to Reign podcast.